So welcome everyone. My name is Caitlin Brown. I am a social worker, a yoga teacher, and a yoga therapist in training. So today we're going to start with a seated position, and I'm going to explain a few different options for how to sit. So today's practice will be focused on basic yoga postures or asanas and kind of breaking them down. So how I'm sitting right now is called Sukhasana or easy pose, and it's very common in yoga and in meditation. And then another similar option with just a very slight change is now I'm crossing my ankles, and I'll explain my props in a second. I'm crossing my ankles, and this is called Sadasana, or perfect pose, or a depth pose. Now, I like to joke and say, hey, these aren't necessarily easy pose or perfect pose for everyone. And it's true, and everyone's body is different. So how you sit is, like sitting like this might not be easy for you. Actually, it's not easy for me. It aggravates my right SI. So for me, I like to sit in what's called hero's pose. And I'll show you from the side first. Now this pose is not for everyone, so you could watch. I'm going to sit my butt down between my feet. So this is the pose without any props. As you can see, there is a lot of flexion in the knees. It's a lot in the knees and in the ankles. So if you have knee issues, this might not be the pose for you. I like to do Balasana or hero's pose with a blanket for a little more support under my knees and feet, and then sitting on a meditation cushion between my feet, or you could use a block or 2 blocks or a pillow. Another option to sit is to sit with both legs straight out in front of you. This is called staff pose or Dandasana. And with any of these poses, you can use blankets or a pillow or a block. And that can be especially helpful if you tend to round back in the low back. And then with the prop, it'll help you sit up taller and tilt your pelvis slightly forward. So now I'll show you Dandasana with sitting up on the edge of a folded blanket. So I'm just sitting near the front. It's helping me tilt my pelvis forward so I can get a nice tall spine. Same thing with either Sukhasana or Sadasana. If I'm sitting with my legs crossed and I tend to round back, maybe my hips are tight, my knees are lifted like this, getting a little more support will help me tilt my pelvis forward slightly, let my knees drop, and sit nice and tall. And if you're the kind of person that tends to overarch in the low back, just paying attention to that. Make sure that you're not overdoing the tilt forward. And if it's more comfortable to sit against a wall, that's another option. So here's staff pose, sitting back against a wall. And of course, you can always sit in a chair if that's best. So just come to whatever is comfortable for you, maybe taking a moment here to explore a couple different options. And then we're going to start with a very short meditation, just a couple of minutes. And again, you don't have to sit like me, especially if you're taking care of your knees or your ankles. We're going to take a mudra by bringing our thumb and our first finger together and bring the backs of our hands to our legs, maybe to our knees, getting a nice tall spine. And maybe you close your eyes here or just gaze soft away from the screen. So mudra translates as gesture or hand position, energy seal. It's a way to move energy through the body. And this mudra is called Gyan or Chin Mudra, and it's a common mudra for meditation. It's a mudra to help us focus in meditation. So let's just take a couple of moments just to sit, just to notice, just to observe. You might begin to just notice your natural breath. Notice your inhale and your exhale. Not trying to change anything yet, just observing. So yoga comes from ancient civilizations in South Asia, what is now India and Pakistan. And in many of the old texts, and we don't know the exact origins of yoga, but in old texts that began to first use the word yoga, what they're really describing is not sun salutations or some of these like very advanced, fancy, difficult asanas or postures. They're talking about meditation. And so some of the earliest asanas or poses were seated postures, like the ones I've just been showing. Postures with the idea of just helping us prepare the body and the mind for meditation. And the word yoga comes from the Sanskrit word yuj, Y-U-J, meaning to yoke or unite. The idea of uniting body, mind, and spirit. Of uniting the body with the breath. Of uniting our individual consciousness with higher consciousness, or perhaps a higher power. So we'll just take a few more moments here, just sitting, no right or wrong, nothing to do, just be. So now I invite you to begin to deepen and lengthen your breath. As you do this, also checking in with your body and seeing if it's still comfortable. If you need to switch the position you're sitting in, please do so. If you can, breathing in and out through your nose, finding what we call our yogic breathing, our foundational breath, of trying to use the lungs completely. Often we just breathe shallowly and only use part of our lungs, but we're trying to completely fill the lungs on the inhales and expand, and then completely empty the lungs on the exhales. So finding this expansion on your inhale of your chest, of your belly, of your rib cage, and a slight contraction or drawing in on your exhales as all of the air leaves your lungs. And if you can't breathe easily in and out through the nose, you can always breathe in through the nose and exhale through your mouth. So we always want to come back to this breath and check in with it. Make sure that whatever we're doing in the physical body, whatever asana we're doing, that we can still maintain this deep diaphragmatic breath. And I invite you now to place one or both hands over your heart, or perhaps hands, palms touching in Anjali Mudra in front of the chest, still having eyes closed or soft, and setting a sankalpa. And sankalpa translates from Sanskrit as heartfelt desire or resolve. So trying to tune into your heart. What is your heart's desire? And this doesn't have to be a big, lofty, life-changing sankalpa. It could be a sankalpa just for today. Kind of up to you. Think of what you need in this moment. When you're ready, we're going to release our hands down, and we're going to move to our hands and our knees. So we're going to come to what we call in yoga tabletop pose. So generally in tabletop, our knees are under our hips and our wrists are under our shoulders and our fingers are spread nice and wide. And if you can't be on your knees, you could always stay seated for this or sit in a chair. And a couple of other options, if you have sore wrists, you could bring your fingers to turn out a little or bring them even a little in front of your shoulders. Another option is making fists and having the fists down, and that can take a little pressure off of the wrists. Another thing I want to point out is your inner elbow. So I tend to hyperextend, meaning I do this. I lock my elbows and my inner elbow points straight forward. So if you tend to have a lot of flexibility, this might happen for you. So what we want to try to do is bring the inner elbow slightly in. It's kind of halfway between forward and directly to the side. So if there were lights coming out of the inner elbow, they would form an X in front of you. And you might also hear me say, soften your elbow or your knees in some of the standing poses if you tend to hyperextend or lock. So you might see me hyperextending, and I'm trying to do the same thing. I'm trying to remember to soften. And then with our backs, we want to think about drawing our navel in, so we're engaging our core, but we have natural curves in our low back. So our back isn't going to be perfectly flat. But again, like I mentioned when seated, if you do have the tendency to really overarch your low back, pay attention to that here and see if you can draw your low belly in, engaging your core, to help keep more of a neutral spine. So from table, we're going to move through cat and cow. We're going to inhale and drop your belly and lift your gaze, tilting your pelvis forward. Exhale, round, draw your navel in, gaze back at your legs. Pelvis tilts back. Keep going, following your own breath. And if you're seated, you can do this similar position, either sitting in a chair or sitting with legs crossed. If this is better for your knees or your arms, you just bring your chest forward and look up, and exhale and round back. So either version, cat and cow, is great for waking up the spine. Great if your back is feeling a little stiff. Do one more round. And then from here, we're going to come into a balance pose. We're going to begin to bring our right leg back. Keep your toes down. And then begin to walk your left fingertips forward, your opposite arm. And again, think about engaging in your abs. And then you could stay here, or you might begin to lift your arm and your leg. Or you could always just lift one. You could just lift your leg or your arm. Continue to breathe deep and even here. A couple of tips. You want your thumb up and your palm facing in like you're shaking someone's hand, thinking about keeping your shoulder in the shoulder socket rather than really reaching forward. And then you want your foot flexed and your toes and your knee pointing down to help keep your hips even. Again, remember your core here. One more breath, long neck, gazing down. And then next exhale, slowly come down. And let's just sway the hips side to side. And let's come off of the wrists for a moment just to give them a break. Do some wrist circles. And then we'll come back down and we'll do the other side. Again, lining up knees under your hips, wrists under your shoulders, gauging the core, having the arms strong but not locked in the elbows. Bring your left leg back. So keeping your toes down and really reach through your heel to stretch your calf and your hamstring. And then walk your right fingertips forward. And you can always stay here with hands and knee down. Hands and toes down. Or you could begin to lift up. Breathing deep here. Engaging in the core, trying not to hyperextend in the elbow. And remember, you can always do one. If you need the support of both arms, you could just do the leg, or you could keep the toes down and just do the arm. You could also do this sitting in a chair, extending the arm up towards the ceiling and the leg straight down to the side. One more breath. And with your exhale, come down. Now from here, we're going to make our way to child's pose. So a couple of options with child's. We'll do knees wide for the first one, and we'll sink our hips back, reach our arms forward and our forehead down. So if you can't comfortably bring your forehead down, you could rest it on a blanket or a block. And if it's hard to bend your knees this much, you could do a blanket behind your knees. And in Balasana, in Child's, we're thinking about extending our spine, lengthening it, and breathing into our hips here. Take one more breath here. And then slowly lift up. We're going to do another version of Child's in a moment. So Child's is often a nice calming, restful pose. Great one to do in the evening before bed, but it might not be for you. It's not for everyone. Like if you have hip issues or maybe ankle issues or knee issues, I'll show a couple other options in a moment. So now we're going to explore downward facing dog, Adho Mukha Svanasana. From table, we're going to bring our hands about one handprint forward. Same things apply where you could turn your fingers out a little more if you need a little less on your wrist. Another thing that can help is really pressing through the pads of all the fingers, especially between the thumb and the first finger. If your wrists feel okay, your fingers are straight ahead where your middle finger and your first finger are pointing straight ahead. And then you're going to tuck your toes under and lift your hips up towards the sky. Your feet are at least hip distance apart. They can even be wider, even as wide as your mat. Your knees can be bent here. Think about lengthening your spine. So if your back is really rounding, try bending your knees to lengthen your spine and really lift your hips. Your neck is long and you're gazing back at your legs. Take one more breath here. And then come down. We're going to try that again in a moment. We're going to take another child's pose. This child's pose, our legs are together and our arms are back by our feet. Forehead is down. So we're more rounded in the spine here. Just taking the hip element out and some of the hip element out and the shoulder extension out. Sometimes this version is called baby pose. From here, we're going to try one more down dog. And if down dog didn't feel good for you, you can always skip it. You can always do it with the back of your chair or against a wall, especially if you're taking care of your shoulders. So again, from table, hands come about one handprint forward, fingers spread nice and wide, toes tuck under. With your inhale, lift your hips up and back, feet at least hip distance apart. So your heels are reaching towards the floor, but they don't have to touch. You're pressing down through your hands, but your upper arms are rotating outward. So you want to keep lengthening your neck. It's normal that your shoulders are going to come up a little bit towards your ears. When our arms are lifted overhead, our shoulders are going to lift. That's a movement they normally do. But just try to keep the neck nice and long and notice if there's feeling like a lot of tightness or crunching there. See if you can soften. Take one more breath to really lift the hips and lengthen the spine. Breathe into the backs of your legs. And then let's slowly come down when you're ready. Take your time. So down dog is one, if you're new to yoga, can be pretty intense. It gets easier with practice. And again, know that you can always practice using a wall, having your hands against the wall and doing the same action of pulling the hips back. So that can be a good place to start if you're new to down dog. So from here, we're going to swing our legs in front of us. And I just want to show you one more child's option. This one is called seated child. So with your feet on the floor, knees bent, you can just hug and round over your knees. And your forehead doesn't have to reach your knees. You could rest on your arms. But we're getting that similar shape to the baby pose we just did, but from seated. So less pressure being on the knees here. And now we're going to sit tall and extend our legs out into staff pose, Dandasana. And if you want, you might sit up on the edge of a blanket or a pillow. And this is where if you happen to have a strap or a scarf handy, you can use it in a moment, but you don't have to. So we're going to take a moment just to sit nice and tall. Flexing our feet, engaging the muscles of the legs. Feeling our hip flexors engaged to lift us up, our core drawing in. Depending on the length of your arms might be straight, they might be bent. Try to relax your shoulders down here, so feeling your shoulder blades come down your back. Neck growing tall, lifting the top of your head up. So a seemingly very simple pose, but a lot going on in staff pose. From here, with your inhale, lift your arms up. So if you notice, on our inhales, we're generally lifting or extending. And then with your exhale, fold. And with our exhales, we're generally folding or coming out of a pose. See if you can hinge at your hips and with a nice long spine come forward. So if you happen to have a strap here, this could be handy around the balls of your feet, but you don't have to do it. You can always just rest your hands somewhere along your legs. It's okay if you don't reach your feet. You don't have to reach your feet. And if you're taking care of your back, you might stay in staff pose, or maybe you just come slightly forward. So just being mindful and being careful with your low back if you have anything going on there. So this is called Pachimu Tanasana, the seated forward fold. And now if your low back feels okay, and you might want to round, so rather than keeping this very active forward fold where my chest is reaching towards my feet, maybe now I round and I bring my chest towards my legs. But see what feels best for your body. So because I'm dealing with stuff in my low back, I'm going to stay more upright. Take 2 or 3 more breaths wherever you need to be, listening to your body. And with your next inhale, let's lift our arms straight up towards the ceiling and exhale, bring them back down to staff pose. We're going to wrap up on our backs with a couple more poses. We're going to bend our knees, have our feet on the floor, and lay onto our backs. We're moving now into bridge pose, Setu Bandha Sarvangasana. Arms are down by the sides, feet are flat, your feet are about hip distance apart, knees are about hip distance apart. And there's different versions of this pose where sometimes legs are together, sometimes they're wider. But for this one, I think roughly hip distance apart. And then the arms are tight in by your sides, palms down. And even though the palms and the forearms are pressing down, you're rotating outward with your upper arms. So you're broadening across your collarbones and tucking your shoulder blades together underneath you. Your gaze is up at the ceiling, and it's important that when we do lift up in a moment that we want to keep our gaze centered. We don't want to turn our head and turn our neck when we're lifted up more on the neck and the shoulders. And if you have any shoulder or neck injuries, you might want to skip this one or just lift just a tiny bit. Just check in with your body and see how this feels. So pressing down through your feet and your hands. With your inhale, lift up any amount. And with your exhale, slowly lower down, unrolling, lowering your hips. We'll do that a couple more times with our breath. Inhale, lift. Trying to keep the knees in line with the hips. Exhale, lower. So sometimes when we lift up, our knees come up or come out to the sides, and sometimes we use like a small ball or a yoga block between the knees to keep them in line. So inhale up one more time. Imagine squeezing a block or a ball between your knees, and exhale, slowly lower down. Let's let the knees just kind of go side to side, like windshield wipers for a moment. So we're going to do one more bridge pose with the option this time to hold when we lift. Now we don't want to hold our breath, but if you want to hold the position and continue breathing, and I'll show a bind that you can take with your hands underneath you to open your chest a little more, you could try that. But if it starts to feel too intense or doesn't feel right for your body, listen to your body and come down at any time. So when you're ready, with your inhale, press up, lifting up, keeping your gaze up at the ceiling. So just listening to my voice, but come down if you need to watch me. And if it feels okay, tuck each shoulder under, interlace your fingers underneath you and reach your knuckles towards your heels. Imagine you're still squeezing a ball between your knees, breathing deep in and out here. Really opening the front of your body, stretching the quadriceps, the hip flexors, which include the iliopsoas muscles, opening the chest. Glutes are engaged here, core is engaged, but not gripping for dear life. And then when you're ready, slowly release. Release the bind, lower down. Hug your knees into your chest. Just rock side to side for a moment. And then place the feet down. And then from here, begin to extend the legs towards the corners of your mat. We're moving into Shavasana, or rest pose, which translates as corpse pose, which might seem morbid, but it's the idea that we are taking this moment in rest and that we're finding rebirth when we start our day after a yoga practice. If this isn't comfortable to lay with legs extended, you can always keep the knees bent and feet on the floor. You could also take constructive rest where the knees fall together, the feet are wide. So find whatever's most comfortable. Palms are up, eyes might close here. Just letting yourself rest. So we'll end our class here. So I invite you to take a few more minutes here in this rest posture if you can. Feel free to stay and rest a little longer.